This is the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
I'm good. Yourself?
Good. I got my observation for the week. So,
oh boy,
driving with my son, my younger son, last night, and I said, I was giving him the rundown of where we had to be and when, and we need to leave the gym by quarter after. Quarter after. What's that? Like 7:15. When I grow up, I'm just going to say 7:15. I'm not going to say quarter after. I said, why not? He's like, well, why do you have to make it so confusing? And I thought, okay, that's through the eyes of babes, right? I mean, it gives you that fresh perspective you don't think of very often.
I empathize with him because I'm the same way. I'm not a quarter after 10-2 type of person originally. I was always very specific because I'm the nerd in middle school, high school with the digital watch. And, what time is it? It is 7:23, right? It's not, it's about half till, I don't deal in vagaries of time. I like to know when things are taking place. So I can empathize and I certainly understand.
Yeah. Well, he followed up with, why do you even do that? Why do you say, I was like, I don't know. That's what everybody does. So he made me think about it. I've been thinking about it several times today.
Well, I'm sure we could have a very philosophical discussion on time and the, human construct that it is and all that good stuff. But we should probably talk about identity and access management, which is easy for me to say.
Yeah, if we don't do that, I think people are gonna turn this off pretty soon, so we should get to that.
Well, let's talk about privileged access management. And to help us with that conversation, we've got a guest. His name is Paul Lanzi. He's the co-founder and COO at Remediant. He's also a member of the Identity Technical Working Group for ATARC, chair of IDSA Beyond Best Practices Technical Working Group, board advisor to the cybersecurity nonprofit, member of the Order of the Arrow, and a whole bunch more, I'm sure, that is behind the scenes. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And by the way, that introduction makes me sound far more important than I actually am. So thank you for that.
Well, I don't know how you find all the time to do all that, in addition to what I assume is your day job working over at Remediant and, operating, that as an organization.
A lot of coffee, as it turns out, and sleep is optional. So those two things makes it work.
So there was a lot of things we mentioned there, but typically when we're going to, have a conversation, we like to start kind of at the beginning. And, you've been in the IAM space for a while. Maybe you can kind of give us a synopsis of how did you get into identity and access management? Is it something that chose you or did you choose it?
Yeah, well, it really starts back in 1994. I'm going to date myself pretty severely here, but back in 1994, I helped co-found the first internet service provider in the rural county where I grew up, Humboldt County, and the farther northern reaches of California. And one of my first jobs was the guy who had to go create and update and delete accounts. So my very first job was in managing the identities of our customers. So my technology career started off with account management. Fast forward about, give or take 20 years, I was at Genentech and I was working as an IT project manager there. And one day my manager called me into her office and said, hey, we've got this new project. I think you'd be a perfect fit for it. And I said, great. Tell me about this project. Well, it turns out that Genentech's CEO was also a member of Google's board of directors. And when Google launched what is now called Google Suite or Google Apps for Domain, or it's had various names over the years, but basically the concept of having Gmail and GCal, but for enterprises. Our CEO at Genentech decided that we were going to be one of the first companies to adopt it. And so the specific project that I got assigned was trying to figure out how to hook up Waveset. If you guys remember Waveset from the way back days, how to hook up Waveset to Google's, at that time, very nascent APIs for account creation, deletion, update. And we had a very limited time period to get that done. And it's to my knowledge, the first time that at that time it was actually called Sun Identity Manager, but trying to get Sun Identity Manager hooked up to Google Suite and all the challenges that presented. And that was really what really launched me into the identity world.
So that's quite the history, especially when you start talking about Waveset. I think of the, Obi-Wan. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
Well, and I worry that I just triggered a bunch of PTSD in a bunch of your listeners. So I apologize right off the bat for any mental trauma I just caused by mentioning that word.
Well, it's too late now. I guess it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, right, before you get into it. So what about some of these other organizations that you work with, like IDSA and ATARC, which is the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and things like CSNP, the cybersecurity nonprofit? How did you get involved with organizations like that? And maybe you could tell a little bit about some of that.
Yeah, well, just last week you had Assad on from IDSA, and I think you've had Julie on before that. So I will refer listeners back to those episodes because Julie and Assad are far better trained on the history of IDSA than I am. But I can talk a little bit about the cybersecurity nonprofit. That's an area I have a lot of passion around. And the cybersecurity nonprofit really has two missions. The first one is to increase the diversity of the cybersecurity practitioner community. And then the second mission is to sort of increase the level of information security knowledge among the populace in general, right? And cybersecurity nonprofit is amazing. They've got over 7,000 members globally, and they've got chapters in cities that stretch from San Francisco to Chicago to parts of Africa and parts of Asia now as well. And being a board advisor to that organization has been just a fantastic way to look at this problem from a different area, a different sector, because the members of CSNP by and large are those who are just getting started in their cybersecurity careers. And us, the three of us who've been around the block a while, it's often easy to forget how hard it is to break into cybersecurity. And we talk all the time about this massive shortage we have in cybersecurity practitioners, but at the same time, like I hear stories every day about how difficult it is to break into this, like as a entry level entrant. So CSNP is trying to help bridge that gap and find ways to make that easier for new practitioners in the community, especially those who are of a diverse background.
So, Paul, I'm very interested in your background with Remediant. My understanding is that you guys are focused on privileged access management, and Jeff and I, we work with our clients in developing their IAM strategy. We typically start that with an assessment process, kind of a maturity assessment. And one of the areas that we look at is privileged access management. And so, kind of taking the look at the privileged access management capability of an organization and assigning a value, say somewhere between like 1 and 5 in terms of kind of current state maturity and then target state maturity. And so what I'm wondering is kind of, have you formulated a maturity model similar to that, or could you maybe talk through some of the capabilities, at least in your mind, that are kind of at that baseline level of maturity of privileged access management, and then how an organization would kind of move up the scale in terms of increasing their maturity?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to start off by endorsing your kid's perspective of we don't need to do it the way we've always done it, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I helped start Remediant, was when we looked at privileged access management for basically the 20 years that privileged access management existed as a concept. It always sort of revolved around this idea of password vaulting, right? And over the years, password vaults have evolved to be better, faster, cheaper. But at the end of the day, it's all about taking some credential and sticking it in a password vault and then making users go fetch it when they wanted to do something privileged. And so that's sort of the way that it's sort of quote unquote always been done. And when we started Remediant, it was really with this idea that there should be a better way of doing this, and that we should abstract out the concepts of authentication from the concept of authorization or access rights. Password vaults sort of merge those two things together, that if you can authenticate, then you should have all these access rights. And generally speaking, that's sort of access rights to a lot of things, right? And in the Remediant perspective, really authentication should happen however authentication happens, biometric, CAC cards, whatever. And the authorization is really the thing where we can apply the controls, the principle of least privilege. So getting into the concept of a maturity model, it's really about sort of call it three major stages that we've seen organizations sort of go through as they sort of climb the PAM maturity curve. And often, they're pushing the project manager off the curve by the end of this, right? So as a former project manager myself, I have a lot of empathy for project managers that get assigned to privileged access management projects. But at the sort of the base level, sort of the basic starting point for organizations as it relates to privileged access, they often have no idea what's going on, right? They just know that a lot of people have a lot of privileged access, and there's not a lot of insight beyond that, right? They just know it's a thing they don't want to mention in front of the auditors, and if the auditors bring it up, they just sort of like do a lot of hand wavy things to get past it as fast as possible. And unfortunately, there's a lot of organizations still stuck there because historically, privileged access management has been a really difficult thing to go solve, right? It took a year to 18-month project. It caused a lot of user pain and suffering. It broke a lot of processes, and it wasn't really something that organizations wanted to embark upon. So even if they knew that they're sort of at this stage, right? This sort of we don't really know what's going on stage of privileged access management, those projects tend to get the PAM projects tend to get deprioritized in that force ranked list of CISO's projects because it was such a hard mountain to climb. But if you started to climb that mountain, really the next step in the maturity curve is around visibility and just getting some basic idea of which accounts have privileged access where, right? And that is a surprisingly constantly shifting picture. When we talk to organizations, they sort of assume, okay, well, these Active Directories, groups we know that confer some privileged access, and we know that these are the members of those groups or the nested members or whatever, and we know that roughly those groups confer this amount of privileged access. But then if you're able to deploy some tool to be able to go out and enumerate all this stuff, it is shocking, not only how underestimated the amount of privileged access is, but also how much it changes day to day, right? Like this is often a big surprise. So in our commercial deployments, we see something like an average of 450 accounts having privileged access to the average machine on the network, right? The average laptop, desktop, virtual machine, hybrid cloud, whatever it is, something like 450 accounts on average having persistent privileged access on those systems, which is often a shocking number to the organizations when we're able to show them this data, because that's often an order of magnitude greater than what they thought it was, right? Without having this visibility. So the second stage of this, maturity curve or whatever is really just getting visibility and hopefully continuous visibility into the shifting state of privileged access. I think then really the third stage is control. And that's where I see how bad the problem is. I see how much the house is on fire. The control stage is really about giving you a hose and getting you to be able to cool off the fire, pull back the unnecessary amount of privilege access, and really get as close to the principal least privilege as possible. And in the specific way that Remediant does this, we talk about it in the concept of zero standing privilege. And we didn't come up with that. That's a Gartner term. You can look on our website, read more about what that means. But the concept that you get as close to zero standing privilege as possible is really the end point of the maturity curve as it relates to control.
I like that model. One thing that I'm wondering is, in theory, but also in practice, what are you seeing in terms of applying these principles based on risk? Is it, the focus is placed on just doing this for the high risk applications, or is there a maturity level that's appropriate for high risk and maybe not required to be as mature on medium and low risk, or let's just say lesser risk resources?
Yeah, there's two ways I want to take this answer. So I'm going to pick one to jump off of first, but this is a great question, Jim. So I think the first thing is just being able to tie together the PAM data and the risk assessment data. That's actually a really hard problem that goes unsolved in a lot of organizations. I think that one of the sort of unspoken secrets in the IT world is that CMDBs were never really a solved problem. Like we never really figured out how to do that, right? So the kind of risk assessments you're talking about, the tracking, these are high risk applications, these are medium risk applications, these are low risk applications. Those sort of assessments exist in theory in a lot of organizations, but in practice are often outdated or broken. And this is sort of my core point here, is they're often unintegrated with anything else, right? So you may have an Excel sheet somewhere that lists all the applications and how risky they are, or how important it is that you protect them. But that data doesn't ever leave that Excel spreadsheet. And so it then doesn't benefit the PAM application or the antivirus application or the EDR solution that could really benefit from knowing, this is a high risk system, or this is a medium risk, or this is a low risk. So I think the first hurdle to get over is just getting the data about what is high risk, medium risk, and low risk sort of federated across multiple InfoSec applications. And then the second part of this answer is really, okay, like once you know that, once the PAM application has been taught that this set of endpoints or whatever is a high risk, like what's the desired level of maturity? Now, ideally, you want to have visibility across everything, even your low risk or no risk applications. You really should have visibility across all those things. But the level of control, how tightly you tighten those screws can definitely vary by the risk level of the application.
Paul, did I hear you mention that on average there was something like 450 accounts with access to a given resource? Did I hear that right?
You did, yeah. And it's a shocker every time we show this data in these enterprises during our proof of concepts. It's like I said, it's always an order of magnitude greater than what they estimated ahead of time.
Does that, I would assume, well, maybe I shouldn't assume, and this is why we got you here, is that direct access? Is that a combination of direct plus nested groups, nested accounts, things like that? Do you see any, I guess, frequent offenders, on that list? Do you see more, it's SQL databases that typically have the problem versus, Active Directory, or, maybe it's even something in the cloud, right? Maybe it's AWS or Azure or Google Cloud platform that has, different types of risks. Can you talk a little bit about where you see those risks coming in just from the sheer volume, and if there are any prime offenders or prime candidates that from a prioritization standpoint or risk standpoint, you typically see, yeah, we know that usually AWS is a mess, right? There's issues there, or maybe it's SQL or, on-prem AD or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I'd say there's three items on my FBI most wanted list, or my PAM most wanted list, I guess. The first one is local accounts. And this is the thing that people forget about because everyone's obsessed with their directories, like, whatever they're using as their directory. It's like, oh, gives me visibility into all the identities, right? Well, that's actually not true because every computer has at least one local identity on it. And those often get forgotten about, but the hackers don't forget about them. Like they love penetrating those, especially if there's a GPO or other policy that's setting the same password for all those local accounts on all those endpoints. And that is a sin of our past that continues to this day, even in large organizations. And so those local accounts that the directory focused people forget about, that's sort of number one on my PAM most wanted list. I think number two on my PAM most wanted list is deeply nested Active Directory groups. And it's never been a good practice, but it's a thing that just came out of necessity in a lot of cases. But it's often not clear to the IT help desk person or the identity group or whatever, whoever's got the ticket that says, hey, let's add Jeff's account to group XYZ. It's not clear to them that by adding Jeff's account to group XYZ, what level of privilege access that ends up conferring. Because group XYZ probably doesn't have a naming convention that makes any sense, or it's outdated, or there was a reorg 4 years ago and this group never got renamed. And so the knowledge, sort of corporate knowledge about what amount of privilege access that nested group actually confers gets lost very easily. And without some sort of monitoring tool to be able to tell you what that is, it's very difficult to discover this on your own. Yeah, and I think number three on my PAM most wanted list is what you described, AWS, and this is sort of the emerging villain, I would say, is AWS AIM and the similar control planes for the other IaaS providers. They are amazing bits of technology, right? Like this is the kind of thing that when all of us were 5-10 years ago creating role definitions and attribute-based controls and all that kind of stuff, like this is what we wanted. Like we wanted this level of fine granular control within the enterprise, and now we actually have it, right? Like AWS gives us literally thousands of possible entitlements that we can assign to any computer, any user, any virtual identity, whatever. The problem is that without the right tools, the temptation to just give the computer or the network or the user all the access is super tempting, because it went from a problem of, oh, well, I'll assign them a lot of access or no access, to now it's like, well, this is super overwhelming, these thousands of entitlements. And so the default definition is just to give them a lot more entitlements than they need. So I actually think we've unfortunately moved further away from the principle of least privilege, thanks to the granularity of these control panels, even though it's exactly what we asked for.
So Paul, I feel like you've got a blog article there on your PAM most wanted list.
I probably should write one. Yeah.
You really should. And I thought it was interesting how you gave the shout out to project manager, because I feel like a lot of organizations, prioritize privilege access management how they will, but if it's not prioritized high enough, it's the project manager who has to try to run a grassroots effort to get people to willingly participate rather than being able to drop the hammer from on high. I think that's a big part of it, right? We've worked with organizations where, almost from a risk and security standpoint, privilege access management is almost always, jumps out as like the top priority. But maybe it's, the first time that the organization's really thought about it. Others, they know that that's a glaring gap, especially like large organizations who have outsourced data center services. A lot of times they realize that they don't have their arms around who's accessing their most critical resources, and they've got to. And obviously, if an organization's dealt with any kind of a breach that came as a result of an insider with privileged access, obviously things rise to the top. But one thing I wanted to do was use this to kind of transition topics, because one of the things that I really feel like is driving the realization of the importance of privileged access is the advent or the age of the cloud, AWS, DevOps, all these new forces that are entering the enterprise, have been here for a while for many organizations, or really picking up ahead of steam in others, but realizing that these are new technologies, they need to be dealt with in a new way, and they present new privileged access challenges, and organizations are realizing that they need to get their arms around it. They may be needed technology. So I wanted to throw that topic at you broadly. What are some of the things that you're seeing with the age of AWS, the age of DevOps, and how it affects privileged access?
I think I've seen some good behaviors and I've seen some bad behaviors, right? So I think last week when you had Assad on, he talked about having a strong identity, ups your whole cybersecurity game. And that's as true 10 years ago as it is today, and especially in the cloud world, where if you can maintain a really tight control over the identities that get put into your cloud platform's control plane, then that's a great place to start, because often that gets out of control pretty quick, right? Especially when you've got DevOps engineers that need access, like right now, and other things, especially things like shadow IT. You've got organizations outside of the core IT function that are needing access to specific parts of the control plane, but the default is to give them more access than they actually need. So I think there's a lot of different possible crimes you can commit when it comes to managing identity within your IaaS control planes. But getting a really tight control over who even has the ability to log into them is really a great first step. I think the next layer down in the difficulty and the crimes committed in the age of DevOps and cloud is this default thinking that it's too hard to manage the individual entitlements on an ongoing basis, and thus I'll just assign all of them, or I'll assign large groups of them, and not think about it again. And that's sort of setting us up for problems down the road, but it's also setting us up for problems in the immediate term, because if any of those accounts get compromised, they can, attackers know how to use compromised AWS IAM control plane access to be able to add additional entitlements and then use those to move laterally within the hybrid cloud. So I think there's some real challenges there. I think the other thing that we're setting ourselves up to repeat is all the sins of deeply nested Active Directory groups. So just because Active Directory groups are on my PAM most wanted list, deeply nested Active Directory groups are on my PAM most wanted list, I think we're seeing some bad behavior start to emerge even in the IaaS control planes, where without necessarily exactly nesting them, you're creating sort of lots of different entitlement groups that tie back to maybe one person or one account. And then it becomes difficult to manage. It will become difficult to manage those in a few years. And so I think that unfortunately, we're setting ourselves up to repeat some of the same problems that we lived through in the days of on-prem Active Directory.
I know we've been talking a little bit about what a mess AWS and other kind of cloud, we're picking on AWS, we're just using an example, right? But AWS, Azure, and the IAM controls there, and I kind of liken it to sometimes you don't know where the string leads as you start to pull the permissions and figure out what's going on there. And I think a lot of times, a lot of these cloud infrastructures were not really designed with, proper IAM governance to start with. It's usually a tactical thing. Some group went off and said, hey, you know what, we need to stand up, whatever platform for whatever reason. And it wasn't really part of the scope of a security program, or it was brought in after the fact and a cleanup never took place or anything like that. I'm curious if based on, what you've seen in your travels, does that tactical thinking resonate with what you've seen, or do you see other reasons why it's been such a challenge to take what everyone said that they wanted, right, with these granting of permissions, and really didn't do a good job maybe of setting it up initially because it wasn't a strategic approach to managing the entitlements in those areas versus, again, just taking more of a tactical or project-based approach?
Well, I'll do you one further. Let's presume that the organization had the foresight to do a really strong strategic stand-up of their IAM control plan for AWS or whatever the equivalent was for whatever IaaS they were using. Let's say that they spent 6 months planning it out and they had it perfectly aligned and they created all the right roles and they assigned all the right entitlements to the right roles and the right roles to the right users, et cetera. And then there's a reorg, or then there's a corporate M&A, or then they sell off a division, or then they decide to switch IaaS providers. Like, there's so many line of business events that can just totally disrupt these carefully laid plans that identity teams make. I have so much empathy, right? Because I've lived through this myself, working in the biotech industry for more than a decade. Biotech industry loves nothing more than M&A, and this happened to us so many times when it's like, oh, we've got the perfect thing, and then oh no, it's disrupted by life, right? By the corporate events or the business events that are happening. So I think there's a lot of different things that can disrupt it. I think that if I want to jump into solutioning instead of just admiring the problem, I think the solutioning is to really be agile in how you think about these things, right? And just expect that there's going to be some disruption down the road. And so, and I say this as an IT project manager that loves nothing more than the triple constraint and finishing projects, et cetera, but sort of plan that your project is going to take longer than you thought it was going to, and you'll probably end up repeating that project at some point in the future, right? And so make sure you leave behind the assets and the information and the decision making and all the other things that you use during this project to make it easier to execute the next time, to do the next cleanup or the next part of the M&A activity or whatever it is, to go back and revisit, in this case, the IAM control plan, but it could be some other part of the identity ecosystem as well.
I think that's great advice. Hindsight's always 20/20, right? You're looking back and should have, would have, could have, right? All the things that could have impacted that. But if you leave those artifacts behind, you can kind of justify at least the thinking at the time. And the great thing about the mind is that it can change, right? You don't have to be stuck in the same decision forever. It is okay to get smarter, right? As your viewpoint and the world and the capabilities around it evolve. So I think that's a really great point. I think also from the strategy of managing IAM as a whole, there is sometimes competing priorities when it comes to who's responsible for what. Maybe InfoSec is responsible for kind of IAM at a top level, but they may delegate privileged access management to the server team, right, or the IT infrastructure team, or whatever it's called within the organization, because they're the ones closest to those resources, those sorts of things. From your viewpoint, who do you think should own PAM? Is it what I kind of described? Is it a hybrid model? And understand, right? We know that no one size fits all, right? It's going to be different for every organization. But is there something that's jumped out at you as maybe something that people listening could take into consideration when we're thinking about where does PAM fit within my organization?
Yeah, and to be honest, I have a bit of a contrarian view on this one. So if you're listening to this, buckle up, right? Because we're about to go on a wild ride. And that contrarian view is actually, it doesn't matter. It actually doesn't matter who owns the responsibility for privileged access. It could be the IT operations team, it could be the identity team, it could be the InfoSec team broadly. What actually matters is how you measure the success of the PAM function. And for me, if I was CISO for a day and I had a dashboard, an operational dashboard, and I was looking at the row that said privileged access management, it would be two measures. One would be how much standing privileges are in the environment, how many persistent privileged accounts, how many accounts with persistent privilege access are there, and then the second one would be how often are just-in-time entitlements used. And those are the two measures that matter the most to me if I was sitting in the shoes of the CISO, whoever ultimately has responsibility for the information security of the organization. And then as far as which organization actually runs the tooling for that and provides that data and trains users and goes after scufflaws, that sort of matters a lot less to me, honestly.
I feel the same way. As long as somebody owns it, I feel like that's kind of the answer that I look for. I think Jim and I have had conversations about this in the past on different episodes and just in our normal day jobs is who owns identity and access management. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter as long as someone owns it. And, there is kind of like, if you think about it from a racy perspective, right? Who is the A? Who is accountable for it? And I kind of feel like it's like Highlander. There can only be one, right? Someone has to be able to make the decision, break the log jam, take ownership. It falls to them, and whatever it looks like in an organization. But as long as someone owns it, I don't think it really matters. You talked a little bit about, being CISO for a day and measuring PAM, and you mentioned some things that were kind of based on, indicators of risk maybe associated with number of accounts or privilege entitlements, those sorts of things. What are some other methods? And maybe I'm throwing you on the spot here, but how else would you measure success for privileged access management beyond that? If I'm a practitioner and I'm thinking about putting in a PAM tool, what are ways that I can kind of justify not only the tool itself, but the reduction of risk of the organization that people can think about?
Yeah, spoken like a guy who says the time is 7:23, right? So you and I are cut from the same cloth, my friend.
Numbers don't lie unless you want them to.
we are both data-driven decision makers, I suspect. And I think that a good PAM effort, whether it's a project or an ongoing function, is run the same way. It's driven off of data. So the two data measures I just mentioned would be, for me, if I had to pick two KPIs, those would be that, right? How much persistent privilege access is there in the environment? That number should be going down. That number should be trending downward. And how often are just-in-time privilege access entitlements utilized? And that number should be either flat or trending upward based on the organization's situation. I think beyond that, you can certainly get into other measures, like how frequently are endpoints assessed for how much privilege access they have. And then in an organization that has, I would say, a distributed IT function, you could call it shadow IT, you could call it, departmental IT, you can call it whatever. How well integrated are those sources of privilege access integrated back into whatever the core PAM function is, whether that's run by IT or someone else? How cohesive a picture across all the different departments of the privilege access management is available within the organization would be another critical measure. I think another one is how the PAM project or solution or service is evolving over time. I think this is one of the things that really gets us, really bites us, is that we don't think about the evolution of the PAM technology. And so when organizations started to do hybrid cloud rollouts, like the PAM solutions at the time just didn't keep up with that. Like they just weren't ready. And so they fell behind, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of these IaaS deployments in large companies still have a lot of unmanaged privilege access because the tooling wasn't available when the organization started it, and they never went back to update the tooling or apply it to these new sources. So thinking about what does my PAM service look like a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now is another key measure. And it can't necessarily put that into data, but it's a critical thing to be thinking about and planning for ahead of time.
I'm glad that Jeff joined in and agreed, because I'm going to take the contrarian view, and I don't want to be arguing with you, Paul. I'd rather argue with you and Jeff. No, the point that I was going to make is that I do think where PAM sits does matter. And I say that from the perspective that when I've seen PAM projects struggle or fail, it's because of resistance from the end users, the users of that system. They can come up with the reason, it takes me longer to do my job. What if the PAM server's down, and all these reasons why I might not be able to save the world, even though I have my cape. You're putting this piece of technology in front of me that's a piece of junk. So how do you flip that script? How do you get those folks to be on board with it? Well, you put them in charge of it. They run it. And then you say, well, is that kind of not fulfilling our duty? Well, I think what you need on top of handing over the PAM system to the users of the PAM system, in other words, the system administrators, is you need a checks and balances. So you need to have some kind of oversight and administrative capabilities, whatever that balance is, so that you have a checks and balance, but that those users of the system are not, quote unquote, disenfranchised, or that they feel like their ability to perform their job function is being jeopardized. So that's my 2 cents on it, is that I want to see those end users own that system.
Well, I think we're actually in violent agreement on this point. And the measures I mentioned are ways of measuring whether the end users are actually using the system, right? Because I think one of the other things, one of the other skeletons in the closet of us IT folks is that these PAM solutions were often rolled out, these password vault solutions were often rolled out and then bypassed, right? So some really smart sysadmin would just go and set, check out the account, right, or whatever, and then create themselves some local accounts on the endpoints, and then they would just use those local accounts and not have to worry about the password vault any longer. So I think that the measures I mentioned are ways to detect if end users are bypassing the PAM tool so that adjustments can be made in the way that it works, or the training that's provided, or the value that's provided to the end user, so that they actually adhere to the PAM practices of the organization. I think the other thing to say is that you're absolutely right. These PAM projects are historically have been very hard, and they just didn't get done if they didn't have the right level of executive support, which I think was the point you're trying to make. It's like, if you don't have the backing of whoever matters in the organization, whether it's the CIO or the CISO or head of the line of business or whatever it is, CTO, whatever it is, if you didn't have their backing, then these PAM projects would just fail, right? Because they would get partially deployed and there would be a bunch of resistance from end users, and then the project would just sort of shut down, right? They would just never really get done. On average, we see that password vault technologies only ever get to 30% deployment, 30% of the planned deployment, because of exactly the reasons you mentioned. And so I think that the solution is really twofold. One is the increased level of executive support, but I think the second thing is we need to provide a better solution. Password vaults suck. and here I'm standing on my soapbox as a founder of a company that directly competes with password vault. So, grains of salt for everyone. But getting away from this idea that you have to introduce additional friction in order to better manage privileged access, I think that idea is outdated, and there are better approaches to doing this, and that we can achieve both better user experience and increase security around privileged access at the same time.
Absolutely. Great points. So, Paul, we're coming up on time, but I just have to imagine that in your role, you've come across some interesting use cases. So would you mind maybe taking us out with one or two of those kind of war stories that maybe you've gone through, and hopefully some of them come to a bright and happy ending?
Yeah. Well, there's a longer version of this story on our website if anyone wants to hear the longer version of this. But Remediant's first commercial customer was Lockheed Martin, and they continue to be a public reference customer for us, a very happy customer of ours. And their use case was really around regulatory compliance. And it was around a very special kind of regulatory compliance, something that they call instrumented compliance. So Lockheed Martin had been in compliance with all the rules that they needed to be in around the federal government for forever, but they really didn't have the instrumentation, the live instrumentation, to show themselves, to prove to themselves that they were continuously in compliance, right? And that's what our technology was used for, was to bring about this instrumented compliance around the specific regulatory compliance rules around the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Rules. So that's been an interesting one, is to think not just about through the lens of regulatory compliance, but continuously enforced and continuously ensured compliance with regulations. And there's a bunch of them out there that have to do with privileged access, right? So that was one interesting one. Another one interesting one is zero trust. You guys talked about it on your show last week, actually. Zero trust came up, and I'm sure it's come up many times in the past, and hopefully will come up many times in the future. And thinking about, how does privileged access fit into zero trust? Because I think zero trust is often seen through the lens of device and network security, and less often through the lens of identity security. In fact, sometimes I see zero trust denoted as zero trust network access, right, or ZTNA. And so how do you introduce identity concepts into that? And I firmly believe that privileged access is the correct bridge between the identity world and the device and network-centric security world of zero trust today. I think that privileged access makes that bridge work really well. So a bunch of concepts around zero trust, another really interesting use case for us. And then the last one I'll leave, and this actually does end in a very bright story, which is incident response. And privileged access management and incident response have never been considered to be even in the same side of the planet, much less adjacent technologies or adjacent approaches. And again, I talked about this on the Risky Business podcast this past week with Patrick Gray, in longer form if anyone's interested. But the idea that you can actually roll out a PAM solution during an incident response. There's some malware that's spreading across the organization. You're watching compromised privileged accounts being used to spread the malware. Historically, we've only ever been able to bring EDR and XDR technologies to bear in those situations. We now have about a half dozen cases where Remediant has deployed PAM technology over the course of a weekend to help slow down or stop those malware spreads as well. So incident response, yet another interesting use case that's come up more recently for us.
Those are some pretty cool examples. I I guess you could call me a fan of Lockheed Martin, just from the aircraft perspective and some of the things they put out there, like the SR-71 Blackbird, the F-16, the F-22, the F-35. I'm a big nerd, so what can I say? But that's got to be a fascinating kind of client to work with when it comes to that kind of thing. So, and you have been very gracious with your time, and we really do appreciate it. Before we wrap things up for this week, are there any other pearls of wisdom that you want to lay upon us, Paul, before we close things out?
I think just think expansively about what's possible in the identity world. I think that just like Jim's kid, we should break with the old habits, right? There's a lot of emerging technology. I think identity has seen an amazing amount of investment and innovation from the VC world and from others. And I think it's time for all of us to think more holistically about what's possible in identity and sort of break with saying it's 7:15 and say that it's 7:23 instead.
I like that. It's okay to get smarter, right? I mean, it's okay to grow and think about things in new ways. Jim, anything you want to bring up before we close it out?
Back in my day, we said 1/4 and we liked it.
Oh, this
And
is
that's
Jim's
all I got
terrible
to say.
SNL character.
I do my best. I do my best.
Anything else, or are you done with the
No.
impressions?
I'm done with the impressions, but as always, I'd love to connect with more of our listeners on LinkedIn. And Paul, I mean, while we got you here, are you open to LinkedIn connections as well?
Yeah, for sure. Send me LinkedIn connection. Send me Twitter. I'm pretty active on the tweetings. And then if there's folks out there that are brand new to cybersecurity, definitely encourage them to join the cybersecurity nonprofit. It costs $0, and you get a lot of value for that $0.
Good stuff. And I'll have links to all that stuff in our show notes for people to check out in their podcast app of choice or at identityatthecenter.com, another place you can find that information. Paul, greatly appreciate it. Jim, greatly appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.